welcome all of you to a conversation on official statistics with Professor T.C.A. Anant. T.C.A. Anant used to teach economics at the Delhi School of Economics, and he later served as the Chief Statistician of India. So I'd like to welcome you, sir, for this conversation. I'd like to begin with a question which which has sort of intrigued me for a while. I see a marked emphasis in your public engagements, in your newspaper columns on the need to communicate statistics properly. Is this emphasis a consequence of your exposure to official statistics as part of your work in the government?
Yes, in part. As academics, our approach to statistical communication is very different. We are typically focused on making sure that the presentation which we put in academic papers and our research reports is accurate and our use of statistical language is correct. And typically that is all we will focus in teaching our students. So we will tell them what does significance mean, what is confidence interval, what are hypothesis tests, and how do you present the results. So that part most students are taught and they learn that part of communication. But there is a lot more to communication than simply writing your research results in a technically correct manner. This part I learned in government, and in fact there is, let me relate this to, for official statisticians, the United Nations formulated something called the fundamental principles of official statistics. One of the fundamental principles talks about the fact that official statistics can, and in fact while they have said can, I personally interpret it as they should comment on the misuse of statistics, because so much of our public discourse uses statistics and numbers to make their arguments. If the statistics and numbers are not properly used, they can vitiate the discourse quite significantly. So part of what I've been doing since I've retired is start the newspaper column where I try to sort of engage with what types of ways to look at numbers we should be employing. But it's not just that people like me who are retired should be doing this. This is an obligation on all statisticians, and particularly those who work in government, to make sure that the work which they do is communicated and understood in its proper context.
So there's been a complaint for quite some time now that the official statisticians do not communicate properly, and this might be because of political interference. Now, but if we step back in time and see, there might be a longer institutional history to this instead of immediate political interference. So if you see until 1971, for instance, after every census, the delimitation and finance commissions would use the latest data. After 1976 constitutional amendments, the delimitation and finance commission results were now delinked from these census. So from between then and say now, the official statisticians working in say the RGI did not face public criticism or direct engagement for a long time, for almost 20-30 years. And so therefore, you lose the habit of engaging with people. I'll give you an example. So in 1991, the population of Nagaland was unevenly, overstated across the state, but nobody went to court. But in 2001, when there was this delimitation which was going to happen in 2002, a similar inflation of population led to a lot of court cases, political protests, etc. So therefore, for almost 30 years, our some of the official statisticians in this particular field did not face the public criticism or did not have a direct public engagement. So that could be one reason that people lose art of communicating. Then in 2004 we saw there was a major controversy involving the RGI who miscalculated the growth rate, and that was, and so therefore these controversies in this history of non-engagement would lead to have a profound impact in terms of, we will have cast a long shadow on the willingness of official statisticians from that division to talk to people. That's one thing. The other thing is that our statistical agencies, which were supposed to reform after 1991 economic reforms, which altered the political economy, that reform took too long to conceive and then implement. By the time the reforms were implemented, new institutional structures were put in place, you already had newer where you are already undergoing a new technological shift will again alter the political economy. Now, there's a third aspect to this as well. Indian statistics have been we have been trying to introduce computers, right? So as computerization is increasing, so until 1990s, increasing computerization did not really mean it did not have public consequences because it was only within the official statistical agencies. After 2000, increasingly people got access to computers, right? And the social media came in 2013 onwards. So we see that now different government agencies transition to these public internet platforms at different rates, and we had stalled statistical reforms. Now the public wanted things to be available at a much faster pace, whereas the different government departments transition to online platforms at a slower pace. So so there was a gap, in my opinion, of 10 years, if not more, where the government agencies were seen, dragging their feet in terms of sharing data. It's only now that we see that reports are coming out at a very short notice. To just cut a long story short, there seems to be longer technological institutional processes which also explain the communication gap which we have noticed.
Okay, this is many threads in it, so let me try to unpack some of them. Communication, particularly for official statisticians, is a complicated thing, and fundamentally, official statisticians are government servants. Their primary identity is one of government servants. Now, India, government servants have a particular culture in which they are trained. And that culture essentially means that the government servant should be above and not be involved in political debates. For example, that's an obligation this is taught to them as part of their basic training. Political debates in India often have a statistical flavor to them. Statistics have been a major part of political discourse. You are aware of this. You refer to the census and why a decision was made in 76 to freeze the use of census data for delimitation and finance commission, but it was explicitly a political call, because what the censuses were revealing was a demographic shift in terms of which areas were growing faster and some areas were growing slower, and that was having consequences on the ground for power and resource availability. So government took a political call for reasons which are well documented, that they would like to put this political tension which was emerging for a while on abeyance. Now, that was a political discourse and a decision made on political grounds. For a statistician, to engage in this would be complicated. And one of the things which has happened is official statisticians therefore have become very reticent, because numbers which they produce, whether it is employment or GDP or inflation, enter political discourse. Now, for them to present the numbers in their correct context would sometimes mean taking a position in a political discussion where somebody else is misusing the number. No, the fundamental principles say you have an obligation to correct misuse. But what happens if the misuse is happening in a political discourse? Is a government servant required to intervene in a political discourse? This is a question to which there is no good answer. I would like them to do so as professionals, but uh, increasingly in the sort of politicized discourse which is taking place, most people will not understand this and they will view it as another form of government interfering in politics. So that's a challenge which has to be balanced. So that's one element to the story. The second element is what you brought in is technology. Technology and particularly communication has widened the scope of discussion very widely. So, previously, in order to do a regression, you needed to have access to either a lot of time, which is what PhD students had, or access to mainframe computers, which people only in universities had. So, even the simplest of statistical exercises was outside the capacity of ordinary citizens. Today, everybody can do them, not only with ready available of computer, they can do it on their mobile phone. So, the spread of technology and computation power has meant that what was earlier the privileged reserve of research scholars in universities can now be done by anybody. And that has changed discourse enormously because data availability has improved for the same technological reason. We have participated in that. We made data readily available. Processing has become accessible. The software solutions are such that everybody can do simple statistical work on their phone and they can generate all sorts of statistical outcome. Many of these people are not statistically trained. So even when I talked about the fact that we train our students how to write a result and how to interpret confidence intervals, T statistics, significant levels, and so on and so forth. Now, statistical work is being done by people who are not even trained in these simple things which we take for granted, which were taught to us in our econometrics class. So, you are having a discourse taking place using numbers and statistics by a population which is simply being given the tools but not necessarily the wherewithal to make use of them sensibly. Now, once again, for a government servant to put himself into that discourse means that you have to change one of the fundamental characteristics of civil servant training, that civil servants should stay away from these types of discourses. Now, the trouble is statistics being the nature of the animal is such that if you don't make the commentary, if you don't tell people what, the potential for misuse is very high. And as I said, since the data availability and use has spread so much that actually a lot of misinformed debates take place around statistical issues, which is now quite common. In fact, it's very good for me because it keeps giving me material for new columns. But as all of us learn, trying to comment about the misuse of numbers is at one level an endless exercise. So that's the second problem which official statisticians face, and they are unfortunately becoming victims in this very politicized dialogue, because the manner in which the dialogue takes place is the numbers are constructed according to rules and formula and are often without the sort of political motivations themselves. But because the numbers play a role in political debate, the debaters will accuse the person generating the number of having a political agenda, which is unfortunate because it tends to make it difficult for agencies to function effectively. Small point to what you said about the statistical system post 1990 and the 1990s were a challenging period for us. I mean, at one level we saw reform, liberalization, but there was a huge withdrawal of state capacity. Government spending on itself actually saw major restrictions. One of the areas in which restrictions were put in is in recruiting additional staff, and government agencies, not just statistical offices, across the board faced huge challenges during that period. So, when there was a need for urgent restructuring, the wherewithal for that restructuring was not really available. So, in effect, what government started to do from somewhere around the early 2000s, 2002, 2003 onwards, when resource availability improved somewhat and things were a little better, they did start the process of restructuring, but there was a huge gap which they had to overcome, the gap which had been created in the previous decade plus. And that much of that has been overcome through the use of technology. Statistical agencies, like other government offices, now use technology a lot more than they used to in the past. They have not fully internalized it in their workings, because in the past they had worked with old style technology, and a lot of that old style technology doesn't exist. You have a lovely thing which you're working on and you shared with me about use of postcards as a way of tracking survey work. Now the postcard and the postal system has pretty much gone. We don't write letters anymore. The replacement system that you can use, computer based tracking to monitor survey work, has not fully replaced it. And one of the reasons is the tracking systems are there, but their use we've not fully understood because of concerns about privacy and so on and so forth, which still engage our debate about how much intrusion should government do using modern technology. So government is doing more of it, but it's not as much as the technology permits. In fact, private agencies monitor you a lot more than government does.
Yes. No, you mentioned that, I mean, I completely understand that the government servants cannot engage in highly politicized debates, but there's been a parallel development, that there has been a decline in metadata shared by various government statistical agencies. I mean, for me, for instance, looking back to 1960 when A.K. Mitra was there, the amount of, metadata and the and technical commentary which they produce is enormous. Now, this tradition again dies out in the early 1980s across, and this is not only the census but a lot of departments, NSSO, postal department, a lot of departments, I see that their public in the amount of metadata that they release began to decline. It came to almost a trickle by 2000, and now in 2011, for instance, we see a lot of government agencies putting out data in MS Excel sheets without the supporting even the explanatory, minimal explanatory notes. So if you see, for instance, the census, even the National Sample Survey, I mean, a person has to dedicate a lot of time to collect all the necessary metadata to be able to interpret it. Now, in this age where people want to be the first to tweet this or that, nobody has the patience. Now, I think, even though the statisticians cannot enter the political debate, it still is important to revive the earlier tradition of detailed administrative reports. And after every census, every director of census operations and the REI used to put out a document called the administrative report. They choose a 2-volume document, and it gave you detailed notes on every minute aspect of the exercise, the difficulties which they faced. In fact, they would say that, I am doing this for the next REI or the next TC, so that he does not have to start from a blank. And without these explanatory notes, not only people are making mistakes, but even the DCOs and REIs are making mistakes in their calculation because they don't have notes in front of them. The Finance Commission has made mistakes. The delimitation commission made mistake. So I think I would not want them to engage in this political tutu, but I would like them to revive the older tradition. So your thoughts on this?
No, there is some truth to what you're saying. You see, earlier we used to have a system of paper communication, and government had elaborate sets of rules of preservation and archiving of paper records. Increasingly, paper is no longer the major basis on which government communication goes through. So, for example, this thing which you raised about problems which you encounter in the field. Earlier, there was a paper-based process by which a problem was documented, communicated to the supervisory authorities, a resolution would be suggested, communicated back, and all of this would be on paper and all of those records would be archived. That's how you were able to get a lot of the information which you did. Increasingly now, government has adopted technology. So a lot of this is being done on email. A great deal of it is being done on WhatsApp. But government has not evolved archival rules for either emails or what, for that matter, WhatsApp messages. So, for example, survey work is now taking place supervised over email and WhatsApp messages between the investigator and the field supervisor, but we don't have archival rules to back this up. So, the point which you made, that what we produce is not complete because a lot of that information was lost even as the work was going on, because the individuals were not trained on maintaining. Government doesn't have a system for logging electronic communications at all. Now, this is not something which is for the statistical system to resolve as a whole, it's government as a whole. Because earlier, all government paper records were preserved. Now, paper doesn't exist as the principal basis of records. Principal record work is done over email and, as I said, on communication medium like WhatsApp. And it's something which people who work in the issue of governance need to engage with government, saying that we need an archival policy for these. And without that archival policy, you will not be able to prepare the sort of administrative report of the old form. Administrative report is still prepared. What will happen is, after the work is done, the officers will prepare a report, closure report, which they will send and which will be compiled, but it will be not a full compilation of all the discussions which took place, but only a summary of what they remember as being important. So that's really what is happening.
Therefore, technological change also needs an institutional change along with it, so that the institutional culture has to evolve about how to archive these things. Now we've understood how the official statisticians are constrained, or why they are unable to produce the full set of information needed to interpret data. But there is another side to it. In absence of this information, when this statistics go out and we say let the statistics speak for themselves, it actually leads to complications, because if I release a paper on the measurements of electrons and protons, nobody cares about it. But if I say something about employment, everybody, first of all, it affects them, and everybody believes that they know these things. So, for instance, in your public lecture, someone asked that you are saying that inflation is 2 or 3 or whatever percent, but I believe it is 20% because my house rent increased for 20%. So everybody believes that they understand this, and everybody interprets. I don't interpret electron proton measurements from personal experience, but here it becomes difficult, because everybody believes that they can understand it, interpret it, but there is no counter from that side.
There are many elements to this, and part of it I also take the blame for. Let me try to explain. Let's take NSS, something which, the way NSS used to work earlier is, an NSS survey would be done, and then a plan would be made for a large number of reports to be produced. And each NSS survey would identify, as part of the survey design question, all the issues on which people are raising, which are of interest to people from this exercise, and reports would be planned around those issues. So, for example, you would have reports on the community. Say you've got a consumption survey, you would have reports on the community dimension of household consumption. You would have reports on various attributes of nutrition aspect. There would be multiple reports which would be produced. Now, each report would go through the data very carefully. Tables would be generated, tables would be read by experts, vetted. A lot of discussion would take place, and a synthesis chapter would be written which would explain the results, and the report would be. NSS data would not be released until all the reports were complete. So we would have a gap of anywhere between 3 to 4 years after the completion of the survey to the release of the reports. Now, this was taking place at a time when computational ease had spread, and many users were saying, look, we have the capacity to interpret the data ourselves. Let us have access to the data. Please don't hold us up waiting for reports to come out. So, a conscious decision was made to change the model of NSS release. We said we have to work in partnership with civil society. It is their job to read the data and interpret it, our job to produce the data. So we will actually now produce a very limited number of reports. So most NSS surveys now bring out only one report, which is a key indicators type report, and the data is released. They don't do the detailed reporting which was done earlier, partly because reporting is expensive. It used to take a lot of analytical time. That analytical time is being used for generating better and more surveys. Therefore, it has shifted the burden onto civil society that they need to analyze the data more. But here, a very odd problem has happened. Even as our data analysis capacity has improved, technology has eased, a lot more people can do it. The quality of analysis which is taking place in our public institutions has actually declined. If you look at the quality of research which comes on based on NSS surveys in, say, EPW, you'll find that the sort of analytical papers which used to come in the past, very few of them are coming out. I must compliment Azim Premji because one of your colleagues has been trying to rectify this gap by training each pack of students on the most recent employment survey and doing detailed analysis for them and bringing it out as a report. So the students get trained and a report gets published. But that is right now an exception. That model needs to be deepened because it needs to be deepened not just across NSS surveys, but across all government data which comes out. Somebody needs to take the trouble to bring this into analytical protocols, and a much more analytical work needs to be done from the research establishments than what they are doing currently. So, if you expect that the official statistical department will do all of that, which they used to do in the past, but that was because at that time research capacity was limited. Many universities did not have the computational skills needed to process disaggregated data. So, it was decided that it would be better done by the computer center at MOSPI, and NSS will do the reports for them and ISI will. So that it was a way of dividing the work up when computational capacity was limited. But given that computational capacity is now available, we also need to take a look at how universities are teaching statistics and making them more focused on real data and in a manner which they are not really doing. They are still teaching in many university departments. I'm afraid they are still teaching it the way it used to be taught in the 60s, with a lot more of formulas and very little of how to use it in a practical setting.
In fact, the quality of a statistics course is measured by the complexity of mathematical statistics taught. The focus is on proving theorems rather than using the frameworks to analyze real data. So they would often give you hypothetical data to operate upon. The hypothetical data doesn't really have context. So the part of the problem also might be, as you already mentioned, the way we are taught statistics. So I mean, I don't recall any statistics textbook or econometrics textbook which spends even a few which devotes even a few pages to the context of data, official statistical sources, etc. So when the students come out of their MA economics, statistics, they know all the technical tools, but they do not know how to apply them to real data, A, and they do not know if the real data has outliers or abnormalities, how to relate them to real context. So this is sort of interesting, and this is second counterpart to it. The way economics has evolved as a discipline, field, it does not have field component. So the students would know about consumption. So I know somebody who did work on a particular artifact, and who did an artifact and did a wonderful PhD on the production of these artifacts by the state, but had not ever seen this artifact in the entire period of 5-year PhD. So how can you did not feel like going out? He said all the statistics there. So we see, I said you haven't felt you don't have a sense for the material consequences of circulation of this artifact. So you'd like to comment on this?
No, this is an important issue, and the teaching of economics, particularly, uh, there is an urgent need to actually change the way we teach economics itself. I've had separate lectures on this at times on this. Uh, we- our the too many of our textbooks use terminology, concepts, and examples which are alien to an Indian student. It would not be difficult to, given that data is readily available, to actually make those things with populate the textbook and the classroom material with material which they will encounter in their professional career in India. But we don't do that. Very often we continue to use books from the West which are written for students in their setting. They're not written for students in our setting. Even though the economics is the same, the examples which populate the books are very different. It is possible to do it. Some people have. I'm not saying that it's not been done at all. I know, and good friends of mine have taken the trouble to write books. Some are in process. Some have come out of making books on econometrics and statistics, which are populated with Indian examples and with real data rather than artificial data. But they're still not sufficiently widely used or widely accepted. So that is a major challenge. A second problem is there is a certain inertia which takes place in economics teaching. You know, the the concepts and the ideas which populate economics and the way we think about it are influenced from what happened about 30 years ago. So, I'll give you an example. Macro policy, we talked about this yesterday. Inflation targeting is still rooted in the experience of the 70s and the 80s. The fact is, there are lots of contemporary papers showing that globally, the character of the global economy and the character of global price movements is no longer what it was in the 70s and the 80s. But that has not yet penetrated the textbooks or our understanding of the narrative. So we are still teaching something which was, but this is not new. As a student of economics, when I did economics in the 70s, we were taught macroeconomics, which was primarily set in the 50s. And I thought it was a consequence of India, but I realized that it's a much more wider, it's a global phenomenon. Economics is often a generation behind what the current reality is. In order to bring the current reality into the classroom, we have to change the way we teach. We have to teach more current issues as they evolve, not be hung up with what the textbook has. But very few universities are doing that. I'm not saying nobody is doing it, and I know enough individuals as friends who are making their classes up to date, but they're a very small minority of the total number of students studying economics.
Right. Now, let us move to slightly different aspect of statistics. Until the early 2000s, across the world, the state enjoyed a clear monopoly over production and dissemination of data. Now there are corporations which compete, if not clearly, if not own more data than the government owns, and they are more nimble when it comes to adoption of technology, processing, etc. This and now this is interesting because for close to 200 years the state enjoyed a clear and uncontested monopoly of statistics. Does this, and the fact that state and statistics are very closely intertwined, does this breakdown of this monopoly, does that have, larger consequences both for statecraft and the nature of state?
Probably. I mean, what you're saying is correct. That has happened. In fact, today, the largest users of data are none of the states. No, forget India. India is, you can say, is a developing economy and so on. But even the most prosperous economies, the US government control over data and use of data is much less than that of, say, Google or Amazon. They are now the big empires of data. They have access to information at a level or scale. Governments have peculiar challenges in this world. One part is for them to recognize that power is being shared, at least data power is being shared with private sector, and to work out arrangements to work with them. And to some extent, governments are doing that. They are working in partnerships with them. But for third world countries, it creates enormous challenges because much of this data ownership and use is vested in corporates who don't answer to them and maybe in partnership with other powerful countries, for example, the countries in which they are based. That creates a challenge for us because they, the data and the things which they produce are used in political narrative and they influence political narratives on the ground. What should government do about it? That's not an easy question to answer. There are many suggestions to it. One is to develop our own domestic processing capacity. We have enormous competency here, and we need to develop our own rhetoric and language using our data. But the global platforms and the control they have also probably needs government to think about different regulatory measures. China has done it, but we may not be able to adopt China's solution. China did it by simply creating a Chinese firewall, and if anybody wishes to participate inside China, they have to agree to China's terms and references. So, all the major corporates in the field of data, Google, Amazon, have conceded to China a considerable amount of regulatory space. We are still caught up in the fiction of an open economy, with the 90s thing of free trade, free exchange of information, and so on, and therefore have, in a sense, abdicated our regulatory authority. We need to find ways to create regulatory space for ourselves if we wish to have some space for our state, because it is likely that our state will not have the control. I mean, this is taking place in various forms. You find even multilateral agencies which are supposed to be governed by the fundamental rules of official statistics putting out reports which are simply unacceptable. I mean, I had a column on this. ILO partnered with an Australian agency to put out a report on modern slavery, a term for which no official definition exists. They created a definition which suited a certain cultural context in order to argue effectively to say that a large part of the world sees a form of modern slavery because certain culturally nuanced elements are brought into that definition. One example is the system of arranged marriages. Now, arranged marriages are a phenomenon which happens in India, in South Asia, in East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and to a certain extent in Middle East and North Africa as well. Now, it's not a European phenomenon. It's much more an Asian and African phenomenon. The But you can say that arranged marriages have a role in reducing agency, and an individual doesn't have the choice in what they do. Therefore, it's a form of modern slavery. Now, if you use that as an indicator, you suddenly find a whole bunch of countries outside of the OECD bloc suddenly becoming very high on the indicators of modern slavery. Now, this foundation has a separate agenda of regulating trade with multiple countries. And since one of the countries which they identified as being high in modern slavery is China, it allows them to put trade barriers to China, India, trade barriers to India. So it's very dangerous because you have an international agency which is using a statistical tool which is not validated by proper methodological discussion to publish a report. They are able to get away with it because we have not asserted our regulatory authority. The one country which has been asserting, but in a very different political context, is China. We need to think about how, within our political context, we want to expand our space for assertion. We are doing a little bit about it, but it is something in which everybody needs to work in partnership with the state.
Now, in this, there's this major problem that we face is that not a problem but a constraint of sorts is that we are not only an open economy but we are a multi-party, very vibrant democracy. In absence of the statistical literacy which we had discussed in the first part of the interview, there is a tendency, especially of people who may not be in the government, to take any critical report appearing in Western press or from so-called international agencies as mechanically as gospels of truth. Some of them don't even know that IMF or the World Bank does not collect most of the data which they publish. They simply collate, and there has been criticism of the way they collate as well. In fact, and so therefore, in this situation where again we go back to politics of statistics, where we don't know how to handle this. I mean, because if you say that that the international agencies may be wrong, so then you would be seen as being nationalist or being pro-government, or that, without looking at the institutional processes which inform the IMF, World Bank, or any other reports. So I think that is also, I mean, so we have this additional constraint, I guess.
Here, I blame to some extent our own academic community as well. For a variety of reasons, they have become lazy. There is a need for them to be as questioning of global agencies as they are of their own state.
Yes.
While I fully respect the principle that we must question and we must approach government with a questioning mind, I fully agree. Of course, you must. But so must you approach global agencies and international governments with the same questioning mind. We unfortunately don't do that. That is something which is a source of worry. There is a need for us to do that. In fact, IMF and World Bank's misunderstanding of an abuse of data is very well documented. I think you use that book in your course. There's this gentleman who wrote a book on Africa, Poor Numbers.
Yes.
I forget his name now, but I have.
Morton Jervin.
Huh.
Morton Jervin, yeah.
Morton Jervin. And it's a wonderful book, and it sort of illustrates the problems of data which exists in third world countries and in large parts in Africa, sometimes quote unquote condoned by or ignored by the World Bank and IMF. IMF's own assessment process, which is right now in public debate, is so politicized that it's not even worth commenting on it. And sometimes you wonder that because if it were an honest exercise, then you would expect them to apply the same norms and standards universally. They don't. And it's well documented. In fact, in a very well-known critique of the IMF written by Stiglitz some time back, I think 10, 15 years ago, he pointed this out. So there are challenges, but we have to work with this system. And one way of working this out is for not just Indian government, Indian academics to call out things for what they are honestly and be as critical there as you are of your own government. Unfortunately, that spirit of independence is not there.
Now, there's been some commentary of late on how credit rating agencies assign you A plus or these grades, and it said that a substantial proportion of that is driven by subjective assessments of social and political conditions.
That's correct. In fact, there's a very nice discussion of that in one of the economic surveys. The chief economics advisor had done a wonderful piece on some of these assessments. And there is a simple way of actually documenting this. I've often pointed this out. Do and since I speak very often to as part of my public engagement to people who work in investment agencies and all these investment advisory firms, compare the returns which a foreign investor would have got had he invested in India in 2000 and had he invested in China in 2000 and maintained that. You would find that the return which they got in India is much higher than that in China. And in fact, in much higher than that in India over many other developing countries. In spite of that, India tends to get a much poorer rating than all of them. The fact is, the rating agencies have done a disservice to their clients because they are effectively cheated them of this earning opportunity.
Yes.
They are in some sense partners with, if you like, China or other governments by hiding what the true numbers are. And when I talk about fundamental principles of official statistics, since many private agencies have now taken on the role of producing statistics, they have taken on the same set of obligations which official statisticians have put on themselves. And one of the things is to be independent, fair, transparent, report the methods they have followed. None of them follow this. So, my own training and work as an official statistician says, while I fully respect freedom of speech and the fact that everybody needs to eat, I'm not particularly sympathetic to a lot of material which they put out.
There's one more thing that I like to discuss in this interview. The new technologies are producing not only more data, and not only are they altering the ownership of data, but they are also altering the nature of data. And this was something which we had touched upon in the public lecture yesterday, that administrative data are no longer the staid things that they used to be in the past. They are updated more frequently. They are much more detailed, fine grained, and easy to access compared to in past. Now, the fact that a lot more data is coming out, but this data is a different kind of data. Now, this now there's a problem here, because we as in courses in economics or statistics are trained to deal with either censuses or representative sample surveys. Now, administrative data or data from social media, data from companies, etc., is not the same kind of data. It is not amenable to the same kind of statistical tools that we are trained to. So, for instance, now a online delivery company can actually give you district-wise inflation index for a variety of commodities. Right? It could actually, so therefore, but this data is not representative in the same way. So we are not trained to, actually speaking, we are not trained to, process this data and come to stable conclusions. So, what we perhaps are looking forward to is perhaps a major overhaul of the statistics and economics curriculum to deal with this fundamentally altered nature of data.
That's true. And a lot of these new forms of data which have come out, while we are still in a very early stage of understanding how to make sense of it and how to make use of it also. As you said, delivery platforms have access to information which can give you very deep insights, not just into district level inflation, about consumption patterns, behavior, all sorts of things are available in their ordering profile. Some of these insights we are beginning to understand. There is a very famous example which people now use. Google did something very fascinating. There is a thing which is produced in the US using administrative data, something called a flu map. There is a mandatory reporting of communicable diseases built into American law. So every treatment center reports a class of communicable diseases which includes flu to the Center for Disease Control. Center for Disease Control routinely analyzes these reports which come in and produces a disease incidence map which tracks where are hotspots, where are things happen. Now, in the nature of work, because these reports are filed, they're processed, produced, the maps take a certain amount of time to produce. Google did a research exercise where they tracked people's search behavior and generated a map similar using indicators linked to what people will search if they are interested in finding out about a disease, finding out about flu. They mapped it and they came out with a flu map. What they found was that this Google map anticipated the CDC map by almost 2 weeks and was very accurate. So it was quite an eye opener. And it sort of highlighted that the possibility of using modern data in different ways to produce what were traditional administrative analytics uh, is there. This was just one example of this. But one of the things which people then who were analyzing it, they said, but we don't know how long will this relationship be persistent. Because the administrative reporting obligation is built into statute. These search behaviors are fragile. Tomorrow people may not search on Google, they may adopt a different, and in fact, it's already happening. Many people are now using ChatGPT as an alternative to searching. So before that, people were using other social media tools, Twitter, to exchange information and gain knowledge rather than use Google. So these things are very fragile. They keep moving on. So the results will not be necessarily robust. You produce them once, fine, but when you try doing it 5 years now, it will not happen. Technology is changing. People are adopting VPN, which changes the location to search characteristics which were built into Google's analytics quite considerably. So there's all sorts of things which will make the new data not as reliable as the old administrative map which was generated. But it's a possibility which has opened up, and how well we can use it and what in different forms. Your thing of platform is an example of that, are things which we don't fully understand. Partly because we are not used to we have not engaged sufficiently with the private sector to know what sort of data do they have. They would like us to work because they are trying to monetize the data which they have, so they would like to do more, and there are research engagements taking place between these data holders and research establishments to see what else can be done with it. It's an ongoing field. But my sense is when we look back in this period, 20 years on, you'll see this as a time when a lot of churn was happening. And there are lots of exciting developments in data, lots of new possibilities people are working with. Many of our own training leaves us ill-equipped to process it, but the generation I'm training are actually sometimes much better than I am because they grew up with computers in a manner which I didn't. I learned computers when I became a PhD student for the first time. I actually learned how to do an analytics on a computer then. Many of these kids started playing with computers even before they learnt anything.
Yes.
So they will, I suspect we learn on this.
To try to conclude the interview, make it a question about the two hats which you have worn in the past. You've been a teacher of economics, and you've also been a chief statistician of the country. Is there something which you learned by working with the government that you would not have learned if you had not been there, if you had continued as a professor of economics all your life?
Probably one thing which I've thought about is, even when I used to teach statistics and econometrics, I would, like everybody else, teach a large part of my course would be about techniques, probit, logit, 2SLS, 3SLS, all these sorts of things. We would all teach them. I would have a little bit about data quality and a little bit about people that you have to worry about what I call the data generating process and how it relates to the estimation technique. But it was a very, very limited discussion. A part of what I was doing yesterday and some which I'll try to do today also, is to realize that the word data generating process is actually a word which needs to be unpacked and the black box needs to be looked into. It's much more complex than most of us teach in our classes. It has a relationship with the techniques we adopt and it influences the way we use data, but it's something which we have not taught very well. And unfortunately, not enough effort goes into our teaching, because a lot more of our teaching effort is on technique and not enough is on unpacking this data generating process so that people can better understand how it interfaces with the use of technique. So that's something which I have learned, and I am hoping to improve that by communications, where I write about these things wherever I do.
Thanks a lot for this extremely engaging conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.